Why did your father have you drive 100 miles a day to attend school from eighth grade to 12th grade while still working on your farm? And how did that influence your approach to education and integrity?
Well, my father was an immigrant from Northern Ireland, actually, and he only had a couple of years of formal education. We were living west of Washington, D.C., and I was going to the local rural school up until through seventh grade. Then high school came along, junior and senior high school, and the local school, no one went from that school to college very much. He wanted me to go to college. And so he made arrangements for me to go to a school in Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown area. Quite a good public school. It didn't cost anything. He didn't have money, but it was, and so he arranged for me to drive in every day. That was for 5 years. The first year he drove. After that, I drove and brought my brother and sister along. And for him, and this is really important to me personally, he was dedicated to my getting an education that he didn't have. He thought that was really important. So I still hold that as a rather a treasure on his part.
What is the state of American health today? Are we ranked 42nd? Are we really ranked 42nd in health compared to other countries? Why aren't we doing better compared to other countries if we spend so much more on healthcare?
Good question. The fact of the matter is, those rankings of how well we do, they vary a little bit depending on what kind of metrics you put into that calculation. But we're ranked 44th according to one and 28th in another, somewhere in that territory. We should be number one because we pay the most per capita for any country in the world. We use the most drugs, the highest use of drugs of any country in the world. So we spend all that money using all that drugs. We ought to be ranking number one, right? If it's working, it's not. We're ranked somewhere between, depending on how you do it, counting life expectancy or delivery services, whatever. We're somewhere in the neighborhood of between 28th and 44th, depending on how you add this up. It's just not a good record.
You just published a paper wherein you hypothesize a beneficial effect of plant-based food consumption on COVID-19, not just by increasing comorbidities, but by directly increasing immunity to the virus. Can you explain this?
Yeah, that's very exciting. The coronavirus obviously came and visited us just about a year ago or so. And it turns out that when I first was hearing about that, like everyone else, what's the story here? And I recalled that we had some data from our China study of over 30 years ago. And some of that information was an enormous amount of information, but some of the information concerned a virus initiated cancer. I'm talking about liver cancer, primary liver cancer. And that's a serious virus. Some people list it as the most important in the world, 700 and some thousand deaths per year. That's nothing to sneeze about. So we collected a lot of information on all these different diseases in China, including that one. So we had a lot of nutritional characteristics. We also measured, mind you, this is 30 some years ago, we measured the prevalence of hepatitis B antigen. That's the active virus. We measured, who had that. And this is among some 8,000, almost 9,000 people. So we had that figure, the amount of antigen in these people. We also measured the prevalence of antibody. That's a degree of immunity, as you know. So we then could ask questions. What factors controlled how much antigen, how much antibody? In other words, the active virus versus inactive. It turns out that according to a number of different indicators of food consumption, namely, especially concerning plant and animal food consumption, increasing plant food consumption increased the formation of antibodies dramatically, highly significant. We say in statistics, the P level of 0.001, for example. And that was not related to the formation of antibody. That was not related to the liver cancer, deaths from liver cancer. In contrast, the animal food consumption there, which was very low by our standards, but it was enough. surprisingly, it was enough to give us some information. And increasing animal food consumption was highly associated with antigen, the active virus, and it was highly associated with liver cancer. I mean, it could not hardly be clearer. Animal food consumption turns on the virus to cause liver cancer. Plant food consumption does the opposite. It makes antibodies. The question, and so that was just announced February 1, just 2 days ago. That was announced, and now it's an official publication. It's open access. People can see it. They can have a look at my data. And I have never seen data quite like this that was so robust. That means it was highly statistically significant. Just to add one more wrinkle to that, at that time, given the animal protein was turning on liver cancer, so to speak, we did that study, an experimental mice study. The mice had the gene for causing the cancer from the hepatitis B virus, okay? It turns out that liver cancer formed in those mice only when we were increasing animal protein consumption. The same thing we saw in humans. You put two things together, and then you compare animal food with animal food as an antibody and vice versa. It's so robust. It's so robust, and the information that we have there that no one else has, to my knowledge, is about the same as it is for, let's say, prevention of heart disease and cancer in general, diabetes. So it's the same formula, the same strategy, the same nutritional strategy that works on degenerative diseases also works on viral diseases. That's my hypothesis.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well-formulated plant-based diet. A high insulin level signals fat synthesis and storage, and a low level, its release as free fatty acid back into the circulation, observed the Harvard University metabolism and diabetes researcher George F. Cahill Jr. in 1971 in the prestigious Banting Memorial Lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association. This process is like a switch. When fat cells sense the presence of insulin in the circulation, as Cahill described it, they respond by storing fat and inhibiting its release, and we get fatter. When insulin is undetectable, we burn stored fat for fuel, and we get leaner. The metabolic state of ketosis, from which the keto diet gets its name, happens when carbohydrates are restricted almost entirely, and fat provides most of the fuel for the body. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine. Yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal source foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form. and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. So what are your thoughts, again, on that passage from Gary Taubes?
That's quite a mouthful that he is offering there as far as the effect of carbohydrate is concerned, on insulin and therefore of diabetes and obesity, if you will. I understand his position on that. It's an old study. He didn't do the work himself, but I think the best way to address that rather complex set of circumstances is to point out first, they use the word, he and others in the keto business use the word carbohydrate very loosely. Carbohydrate only found in plants, except for a tiny bit in animals, but we're talking about the carbohydrate in plants. There's a very complex mixture of substances. Dietary fiber comes under that sort of umbrella, if you will. So the carbohydrate in plants is a variety of things. In the natural form, when we're consuming as whole food, we get a lot of fiber to go along with it. We're also consuming some other things that are really important, like the kind of protein, the amount of protein, antioxidants and minerals and so forth and so on. And so when we're consuming a whole food, plant-based diet, we're consuming the kind of carbohydrate that works well for reducing degenerative diseases. Any comparison of, let's say, different societies with respect to the consumption of carbohydrate, if we pay attention just to the carbohydrate of plants, it really works well. The problem with that argument that Gary Taubes and Dr. Robert Atkins and a few others have made is that they tend to focus on the effects of refined sugar. That's carbohydrate, but that's not the kind of carbohydrate we're consuming really when we're consuming whole foods. When we consume whole foods, we got the rather large complex mixture all working together. And even that, there's some evidence that if somebody suddenly switches from, let's say, a high carbohydrate diet to a low carbohydrate diet, if you will, by replacing it with animal foods, we can see a reduction in body weight. We can see, the ketosis sort of thing arise, and that excites people. But the problem is that people are switching from a diet that is not whole food, plant-based. They're switching from a diet that is really high in refined carbohydrates. Different ballgame. Different ballgame.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? When I started reporting on this subject as a journalist 20 years ago, virtually no meaningful research had been published to test the claims of the diet book doctors, most famously Robert Atkins, who advocated this way of eating. Since then, carbohydrate-restricted diets, keto or otherwise, may have become the most tested diets in history. The website clinicaltrials.gov reports more than 100 clinical trials of ketogenic diets in progress and nearly 90 completed. The findings are consistent. Ketogenic eating is safe and effective at controlling both weight and blood sugar. Pick a disease, from Alzheimer's and anxiety disorders to traumatic brain injury and tumors, and researchers somewhere are probably testing whether eating a ketogenic diet improves its prognosis. In 2019, the American Diabetes Association concluded that low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate diets, that is keto, were the only dietary therapies that consistently resulted in beneficial outcomes for adults with diabetes or pre-diabetes. In 2017, more than 100 Canadian physicians co-signed a letter to the Huffington Post declaring that they personally follow keto-like regimens and now counsel their patients to do so too. What we see in our clinics, these physicians wrote, is that blood sugar values go down, blood pressure drops, chronic pain decreases or disappears, lipid profiles improve, inflammatory markers improve, energy increases, weight decreases, sleep is improved, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome symptoms are lessened, etc. Medication is adjusted downward or even eliminated, which reduces the side effects for patients and the cost to society. The results we achieve with our patients are impressive and durable. So again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
That entire argument, again, as I mentioned before, that entire argument is such that we have to ask the question, what are these patients? Who are these patients? What condition are they in? Naturally, they tend to be overweight. They're subjected to some diabetes problems, if you will. If those people consuming they're consuming a lot of carbohydrates, as I said before, refined carbohydrates, are overweight. Okay, now you put them on, almost just change the diet, their total calorie intake goes down, right? They're going to lose some weight. It's pretty consistent, like those physicians may have noted. It's pretty consistent that their patients lose weight. Impressive. Everybody buys it. That's not the issue. Even serum cholesterol comes down a bit, not that it makes that much difference. So you see these kind of things that look sort of promising in the short run, everyone wants to lose weight. However, that message in the short run, like that, sort of a pharmacological approach, if you will, it's hardly a nutritional approach, that if that were to be continued, what that means is those people on the low carb diet are consuming high fat, high animal protein diets. That's what, in reality, that's what happens. Okay, so then you ask the question, what happens to those people over time? Over, let's say, years? How do societies compare? It turns out the greater the consumption of animal protein, the higher is the risk for heart disease. The higher is the risk for diabetes. The higher is the risk for cancer and a number of other diseases as well. That's very clear. And there's a number, we call these correlation studies, where the regression lines comes down, right down through the origin, the XY origin, saying that any addition of animal protein tends to theoretically begin to increase the risk of those diseases. Exactly the opposite what the keto people talk about, exactly the opposite. So what they are doing, in my estimation, I know this is strong words, they're doing a disservice. They're using short-term results to imply or infer to the population at large that, look, we got to decrease carbohydrate intake. That means plants. Let's increase fat and protein because that's what people like. It sells. That's the equation. That's the marketing. And so in the long run, when people do that, there's no comparison. There's just irrefutable. Society that consume more animal protein, animal fat, or animal foods, if you will, heart disease goes up. There's a number of studies that have shown that for 55, 60 years. And and that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument, too, is that when people who have diabetes, they're switched to a whole food plant-based diet, right? That's a lot more carbohydrate, right? But it's the right kind. It's whole food. More carbohydrate, not the refined carbohydrate, mind you, not added oil, but they're, whole food plant-based diet. Those people see a beneficial response within 1 to 2 days. So dramatic that, especially for diabetics, if diabetics are on their insulin and they switch to this whole food plant-based diet, and they don't stop their medication, the insulin reducing medication, the dietary effect on reducing insulin is so great that if they don't stop their medication, they can end up in hypoglycemic shock. So strong is that dietary effect. It's exactly the opposite of the keto people. The keto people are looking at short-term things that sort of in the short term look sort of impressive. It sells people. They will lose some weight. And yes, maybe the diabetes relieved a little bit. However, that's not a solution for long-term health. Just simply isn't. It's exactly the opposite. Dangerous.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? No meaningful experimental evidence, no clinical trials exist to support the contention that we would live longer, healthier lives by eating mostly plants rather than animal sourced foods.
Well, there's not, we can't do those kinds of studies. That's really foolish. Anybody who is in science will know this very well, the clinical setting. He's inferring, at least the kind of study we need to do is like an intervention study. Okay, you eat this group, you eat that, right? We'll do it for a while and see how it works out. Maybe after, I don't know, a month, two, maybe a year or two, something like that, we'll switch it. We'll do a crossover. That's a classical sort of intervention type of clinical trial, right? Who in a right mind assumes that you can do that kind of study? I mean, you got one group eating lots of plants; they're used to it. They're happy with that. Another group eating a lot of animal food, right? Now you all of a sudden going to tell them just for the purpose of the researcher, let's switch. That's nonsense. They don't do that. And number one, number two, they tend to know what the other's doing, or they slip. They just don't do it. So if that's the metric, if that's the determinant whether or not research has been done on this question, it's wrong. People who make that kind of argument simply don't understand research. And that brings me to one more comment I might make on this particular point, namely the randomized controlled trial, RCT randomized controlled trial, which is so popular, is said to be the gold standard. Okay. It is the gold standard if we're going to be testing a single chemical, in which in one group, they're taking a chemical, a drug, if you will, or a nutrient. The other group, they're not. The second one, they don't know what they're actually taking. They could be in a placebo group. So they don't know whether it's placebo. Many times the investigators should know it. That's fair enough for testing drugs. I'm not interested in testing drugs and single nutrients. That's the gold standard for that kind of thing. The gold standard for total diet, whole food, is the observational study, where you allow all the stuff in the food working together as magic formula, which I refer to as the concept of holism. There's lots of data to show that's really to work. So, or case control studies, same thing. If you switch over to a plant-based diet, and this kind of stuff has been done, we can see the results that we get.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? The big difference between the physicians and researchers who admitted to using keto 20 years ago for temporary weight loss and those eating and prescribing keto today is that the latter now believe these diets are the healthiest way for them and their patients to eat. They don't worry about the saturated fat their patients will be eating because the clinical trials confirm this way of eating is beneficial and they can see their patients and themselves getting healthier, often over the course of weeks or a few months. They are loath to recommend anything else. I've interviewed more than 120 of these physicians who tell me that they chose medicine as a career because they wanted to make their patients healthy, not to manage chronic disease. Getting their patients off carb-rich foods, at the very least, sugars, grains, and starches, and eating something akin to keto makes that happen. When public health authorities argue that a healthy diet for all means mostly plants, they make the job of these physicians and the challenge to their patients that much harder. Again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
Well, these physicians, honorably, I'm sure, are suggesting that they got medicine because they want to make people feel well and feel healthy. Sure enough, I mean, as we just talked a moment ago, if they're overweight and they have predisposition for getting diabetes, maybe they have diabetes, in the short term, if they switch like that, we're going to see what appears to be, a positive response, a benefit, if you will. But once again, it doesn't last. We know that from let's say the Evidence study of some many years ago, 40, 50 years ago, where they were found, those who consume a more plant-based diet, generally referred to as vegan. I don't particularly like that word necessarily, but a more vegan, vegetarian type of diet, on the latest figures that I've seen, suggest that women live about 12 years longer men about 7 years longer. And number one. Number two, to go back to the observational studies again, where we look at correlations. Correlations in this, when I'm talking about correlations, does infer causation, because the correlations I'm talking about involves the whole food. I'm not trying to find one single thing in the thing to account for that, because that's not the way nutrition works. So between the observational studies, the prospective, retrospective studies, observational, the plant-based diet clearly is superior. And I add one more point to it too. This is where my own research comes into this a great deal. We start looking at the things in those whole foods, study them not just alone, but together, and then ask questions like, for example, how do they really work? What we find is that across the board, the material and plants work all together to create a positive, healthy response. They bring cholesterol levels down. They change a lot of things. We did those kind of studies very systematically. And there's almost an unlimited number of so-called mechanisms that work together to create that response. We can't, and exactly the opposite for an animal food diet. So the people, the physicians, as I say, they see that. I noticed you said that they refer to maybe within a few weeks, maybe a few months. They'd like to see that. Follow them up for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years. Come on. People consuming that kind of diet will die earlier. Of course, there's individual exceptions from time to time, but on average, that's really what happens.
A lot of whole food, plant-based speakers sound very convincing, but what do the long-term studies say? When you look at all the unbiased, large, long-term nutrition studies, do they show that whole food, plant-based eaters have significantly less disease and live longer than people eating diets that include animal products?
Yes, they live longer. I just told you about the situation there. And there's some other studies, an so-called EPIC study in Europe that's shown somewhat similar kinds of data. And so, yeah, they live longer, but more importantly, rather than just talking about the length of life, which is okay metric for obviously obvious reasons, more importantly, they don't suffer the diseases, in the last few years of their life. People who use a keto diet, if I can use that word, or diets like that, they're the ones that are going to spend the last 10, 15 years in and out of the hospital, taking all kinds of drugs, having to deal with the diseases that are eventually going to kill them prematurely.
What are the major problems with eating animal products?
Well, the major problem is very simply, a lot of people like to say it's due to the saturated fat. I'm not one of those people. Saturated fat is somewhat biochemically inert compared to polyunsaturated fats, which is present in plants. That suggests that eating saturated fat as much as one's okay. Let's say saturated fat tends to be mostly found in animal foods, polyunsaturated in plant foods. So we have a dilemma here. Saturated fats maybe not being so bad, polyunsaturated fat supposedly being good. Well, that impression arose when we're looking at the correlation between saturated fat intake and, let's say, heart disease or colon cancer or breast cancer. Higher saturated fat, okay, more of those diseases. Higher polyunsaturated fat, coming from plants mostly, less disease. So there was a lot of significance given to that observation in those days, but we now know that's the way it works in the whole food. If we take out the polyunsaturated fat out of the plants, put it in a bottle, that's the way we use a lot of that stuff as added oil, for example. That's not good. We have an entirely different product. The oil that's present in that situation is so-called omega-6, pro-inflammatory, and that can lead to all kinds of problems. So, but when that oil is in the presence of plants, the whole food, it's a very different situation. Everything is working together. The saturated fat in animals, it looks like it has a nice relationship with heart disease and so forth in these observational studies. But actually, and I've just written a new book on this, The Future of Nutrition, and I've traced out some of this argument there. It turns out the higher the saturated fat intake, also that can be accounted for as higher consumption of animal protein. And this animal protein, it's not the saturated fat, it's animal protein that causes blood cholesterol levels to go up. Plant protein does not tend to do that. So you see a sharp difference between animal and plant protein. The question concerning the animal protein has never surfaced very much. We don't talk about it. We talk about either the kind of fat or the kind of carbohydrate. It's really the animal protein. It's not the animal protein by itself. It certainly has its own properties. And I can elaborate on that. It's going to take too long here. All the mechanisms that occur under those circumstances. But it's actually a virtual worship, a reverence for animal protein that people want to consume it. The more, the better. That's why I started out my career, by the way. I came from a farm. I went to graduate school and did my doctoral dissertation on for the purpose of advancing the consumption of more animal protein. But it was strictly the research that I got involved in. It showed me exactly the opposite. So the real question is not the saturated, unsaturated fat dilemma, argument, contest that we're involved in so much, because it's so confounded. But what form those nutrients happen to be consumed in? We got to back off, look at the whole food situation, and then we can see the results that we get. So it's animal protein. It's our impression that animal protein is said to be high quality. That's a misnomer too. That was based on an equation that was developed way back in the 1920s by a certain professor from the University of Illinois, H.H. Mitchell, saying the higher the protein that gets into our system, the greater the absorption of that protein and the greater the retention of that protein. It stimulated a body growth rate. Sounds good. They never took into consideration, they didn't know, and that they never consideration that when that body growth is faster, that means more heart disease, more breast cancer, in terms of larger picture. So it's really, I would argue that it's our I pause to use this word, but it's a reverence. It's a reverence and respect for animal protein as being high quality. Everybody wants more. That's the way it's been for more than 100 years. It's not true.
Do you recommend bariatric surgery for some patients?
That's a hard one. I wish you could ask that to my son, who co-authored the China study with me. He's a physician. He's been with the bariatric surgery group in the University of Rochester, not because he was interested in that, nor am I. He was there because they gave him the opportunity of doing research, continuing on with some of the work that I've been doing with whole food plant-based diets. No, bariatric surgery, yes. It does produce results in people. I'm not nearly familiar enough as I'd like to be to answer that question, but basically, interestingly, people who even have that operation still drift back, to gain the weight they had gained previously. Also, it's an excuse. It's an excuse not to face up to dietary choice and just changing their lifestyle.
A recent study claimed vegans have more bone fractures. Is this true?
This comes back to the concept that I worry about a great deal. It's called reductionism. Researchers, and they have been doing this for a long time, especially even more so these days, it seems like to me, you can pull out one study here, one study there, one nutrient here, one mechanism here, one disease, and you can find out almost anything you want to find out, and then make a big story. It's really not true. If you in the whole food, it's very different. And on the question you were just raising about bone fracture rates, yes, what we see is that the higher, this is comparing populations consuming different amounts of animal protein in this case again, the higher the consumption of animal protein, the greater is the fracture rate. The higher the consumption of calcium in different countries, the greater the fracture rate. So where do we get our animal protein and calcium from? Dairy. So the higher the consumption of dairy, in animal food, the higher the fracture rate. And fracture rate tends to associate with societies that are consuming more animal-based foods. It's very clear. Probably a lot of it attributed to the dairy itself, but also at the same time, they're not getting the benefit of the plant material to help keep the bones healthy.
With cancer, what is the primary difference between initiation, promotion, and progression? Which part do humans have the most control over?
Well, those three stages, so to speak, are a little bit arbitrary, but they're descriptive and not bad to use. Initiation is the first stage when the cancer is forming. And by the word initiation, what that means, generally speaking, some chemical comes in or something else that's equivalent to a chemical causes a mutation in the DNA that can change the DNA. If not repaired, it can change the DNA to actually be in a form that can give rise to cancer. That's initiation. That's where cancer starts, presumably with a mutation. Just the first stages. I mean, we can be talking about hours, days, or something when that kind of thing goes on. It's going on a lot. We repair most of that damage, but in any case, that's the first stage. The second stage is once these early cancer cells have formed from that mutation, if you will, we call them neoplastic or pre-neoplastic cells. Those cells start divide, and eventually go into what you see it as a tumor. That's promotion. That takes a long time, usually relatively long, certainly months, maybe even years for that to progress. The last stage is progression. That's when, in the case of human cancer, they notice they got a problem. They go to the doctor. They find out they got a tumor, of course. Now we're talking about a stage where the cancer is getting more aggressive, and oftentimes it's migrating into other tissue. So initiation of cancer, that's the time during which the cancer is forming. Promotion, the long period in between when it's being cultivated and fertilized and encouraged to grow with the wrong kind of nutrition. And finally, then they end up with a disease that is pretty dangerous at that particular point in time. But we have almost done no research on that end stage, that third stage, especially regarding the use of food. That's what my son Tom is doing now, working with stage 4 breast cancer patients. Now we're talking about something you might qualify as treatment. And it brings up another issue, incidentally. The plant-based diet not only prevents some of these diseases, that's very clear. It actually can be used to treat these diseases. That's the idea that I'm going to suggest is going to carry this argument really into the future in a major way, because people like to know what can I do with my problem now. What we're now learning is that you can reverse heart disease, you can reverse diabetes in just it's amazing in just a matter of days, certainly weeks. So coming back to cancer again, initiation, promotion, progression. And during that second promotion stage, that's where nutrition comes into play. And I liken it to the fertilizer in the yard, growing stuff. If we're eating the wrong stuff, it's causing the cancer to grow. Initiation of first stage, that is caused by mutations, and the mutations are generally understood to be resulting from, let's say, environmental chemicals, or other kinds of additives, if you will. And sure enough, that kind of thing can be shown to actually work. But that initial stage of initiation that occurs can be held at bay for a long, maybe for a lifetime, if we don't consume the kind of nutrients that cause that stuff to grow. Unfortunately, we put a lot of emphasis on that first stage, initiate, which chemicals do what kind of thing, instead of being more concerned about what really matters. That's the kind of diet we consume, the kind of nutrition we experience. Same for cancer, this for heart disease and diabetes and a number of other things.
What is the impact of nutrition specifically on prostate cancer?
Well, the studies that I would like to refer to in that case are out of Harvard, I think, for the most part, a couple of others. What it tends to show is that, and then again, we see a really regression line from right up from days from point zero on up, it turns out that the greater the consumption of, this is some of the best data I'm familiar with, the greater the consumption of skim milk, of all things, the greater the risk of prostate cancer. More skim milk, more prostate cancer, almost a virtual straight line. It's really impressive. Now, skim milk, and you make a comment about that, skim milk as opposed to whole milk, skim milk doesn't have the fat. Skim milk is like a protein drink. It's animal protein enriched. And so the more we consume of that kind, the greater is the risk for prostate cancer. Similarly to this risk for, let's say, breast cancer and urine cancer and so forth in the case of women.
Has your book, The China Study, stood up to the test of time? Do you feel just as clear and strong about your findings today as when you wrote it?
Yes, I do. I have to confess, I wrote the China Study with my son, who's now a physician, incidentally. But I wrote the China Study at that time trying to summarize what I thought I had learned over the previous 30, 40 years. A lot of biochemistry, a little bit complex here and there. But it finally got to a point where I said, well, just a second here. I'm not, oh yeah, and I threw in the work of Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, Dr. McDougall, who had been working with people, some years just a short while before that. And they were showing reversal of the disease, control of the disease. So when I wrote the China Study, I wasn't sure what we're going to see. Finally kind of threw my hands up in a literal sense. I said, just try it. Just try it. You don't need to believe me on all this other stuff. Just try it. Well, since that time, we've seen a lot of evidence people just trying, seeing remarkable results. And I then subsequently wrote the book Whole, which is sort of the more theoretical explanation of some of these things that we were reporting in the China Study. Now we got the new study. Why don't people get to know this? But in any case, the China Study has really done well. It's still selling a lot. This is the 16th year. I have to tell you, it's been translated into technically, I know this is 48 foreign languages. I know it's over 50. That's a lot. And it's nearing 4 million copies sold. I know it's gotten around the world. I've spoken all over the place, both in person as well as virtually. And the China Study is really, as I say, it's had quite an impact, especially when supplemented with the second book, Whole, which is the more scholarly interpretation, if you will, of what I had in the China Study. Yes. And our family, when I started getting into this, from the opposite point of view, I was in the beginning pushing animal protein consumption in the early part of my career. When I started seeing that wasn't exactly right, we started to change our diet. And that was in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. We have a family of 5 grown children, 11 grandchildren, 22 of us were spouses. We all eat that way. My dad had gotten heart disease early in life, even though he's a farmer, even though he was not overweight and all that sort of stuff. He's eating the wrong food. He had a heart attack when he was 62, fatal attack when he was 70. His brother had a fatal attack when he was 58. They were eating, I was eating, of course, in the family, eating a rich Western diet. My wife's mother died of colon cancer at age 51. Now, a lot of families can tell these stories, but obviously that's impactful. I got to know things. We weren't particularly interested in going down that road. Now, next month, I'm going to be 87. So I should maybe knock on wood, but, I've already knocked on wood enough, and I've seen the benefits. I've seen the benefits personally, big time. My wife's seen the benefits. Our children have seen the benefits. Our grandchildren have seen the benefits. So I don't even already need to go into the science and defend it. I can see the benefits as clear as crystal. And that's the way it is. I'm extremely enthusiastic for this, and I would really argue that it's time that the society at large get to know the true facts involving whole food plant-based diets. And I'm not talking about a barrel full of reductionist facts here and there, all these narrow little things thrown into the mix. We can find anything we want to do that. I'm talking about, getting to the fundamental science and understanding how it works. See, I'm as enthusiastic as I could be.
When conducting research for the China study, what variables correlated with an increase or decrease in cholesterol levels?
Yeah, that's a good question. The cholesterol levels have been used for decades, as you know, more than a century, as an indication of heart disease. The higher the serum cholesterol levels, the higher the heart disease risk. And in more recent years, too, the higher the cholesterol level, it seems that the higher the risk for cancer and stuff. Well, cholesterol took on this, it was explained that cholesterol, higher cholesterol levels in the blood, caused by cholesterol consumption, that was the initial idea, then cause an accumulation of cholesterol in the blood vessel, then you get heart disease. That's the old-fashioned story, if you will. Actually, it turns out that the cholesterol in the blood level, that is more influenced by consuming an animal protein-based diet, which is lower in plant-based antioxidant kind of diet. So we get a different kind of cholesterol in the blood. The LDL, HDL, the fluffy kind, the dense kind, and so forth. It kind of breaks down. My point about the cholesterol question is, cholesterol is a broadly speaking, it's an indication of risk of Western diseases. But as far as individuals are concerned, the baseline cholesterol that people have is not necessarily, there's an exception to this, it's not necessarily a clear indication of how much risk they have for heart disease. On average, yes. But I know people who have high cholesterol levels, baseline cholesterol levels, eating the right diet, they're doing fine. People with very low cholesterol levels having heart disease. So we can see this variation, and it sort of begs the question, how important is blood cholesterol? Well, blood cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease, nor is the consumption of cholesterol itself the cause of heart disease. That's a very reductionist idea. Not that one cholesterol we're consuming versus the amount in the blood versus the amount that causes heart disease.
What did your research with starving and malnourished children in the Philippines teach you? And did you see similar results with Americans, or was that result only consistent with the Philippines children?
No, what that did, I mean, that was a surprise to me because I was there in the Philippines coordinating this project for feeding malnourished children. And in those days, not just me, but all of us in the nutrition community, there seemed to be an interest to make sure these kids in these poor countries got enough protein. That meant high quality animal-based protein if possible. And so that's where I came from. I had just happened to have seen, almost accidentally, that the children who seemed to be getting more animal protein, like we Westerners do, those children were more at risk of getting liver cancer of all things. Then there was a study came out from India, using experimental animals showing something similar. I was faced with a dilemma at that time. I'm there to increase animal protein consumption, or at least protein consumption. But we have this. That's what really generated my research program. Came back home, got some money from NIH to continue for the next 27 years, and another grant on top of that to do the China study and a few others. So I wanted to find out. I was troubled coming from the farm, teaching and preaching animal protein, the value of that, and then seeing this. I had to know. So that's what really generated my research program. And we did that. We were not interested in whether rats got cancer or not. It had nothing to do with it. But we used the experimental animals only as a means of studying the basic mechanisms of cancer formation, the basic mechanisms for which, let's say, protein affected cancer formation. And I learned so much, because when you learn at that level, at the biochemical cellular level, and see how things all work together, it's basically what we see in a cell in a mammal applies generally to all mammals. The outcome may be something different, but the basic mechanism is what led to me the concept of principles, how you work together. how they work together and so forth.
What can we do to prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, and memory loss?
That's let's say it's a study, and it's a study, ongoing study, right, ongoing research right now. I can't say, at least from my perspective, obviously there's others know better about this than I do, but it turns out that those kind of problems tend to occur in the more Western types of societies. Consuming this kind of diet, by the way. We see these sort of correlations. We see some other kinds of evidence to indicate too that these folks are at risk. And now I'm reporting on the work of others, not myself. There's some more definitive studies on Alzheimer's, with respect to the kind of diets that are being consumed. And it's kind of fitting this general rubric, this same story. Consuming people say high fat, I'm going to say basically high animal foods diet. They're at greater risk. I think it's a safe statement really to make, at greater risk for those kinds of diseases.
How do we bridge the gap between what we tend to know in science and what we convey through policy-making decisions? Why is the science of nutrition ignored in medicine?
Well, I spent about 20 very active years in policy development on developing national and even international food and health policy, especially focused on nutrition. So I've had a firsthand experience working with that question. What can we do, essentially? And I'm at times I get quite discouraged because if we look at the kind of advice, let's say, that the government formulates for the public at large, dietary guidelines, for example, or let's say the amount of nutrients we should be consuming, those kind of directives, those kind of reports that tend to be updated every 5 years or so. They're very strongly influenced by the Western diet, in turn, strongly influenced by the industries behind it. I mean, the livestock industry, of which I was a part, the livestock industry is very powerful. We know that. They want to keep their business. So in a sense, unfortunately, as we're using that kind of food, we're creating more sick people who serve then as subjects, as patients for medication. So now we bring in the pharmaceutical company. The livestock industry helps to create disease, oftentimes with subsidies of our taxpayer dollars. They, in a sense, are sort of creating the disease and the numbers of victims or patients to serve as customers for the use of drugs. And so in that equation, both ends of both of those pillar points, if you will, we're pushing animal food diet. First, because it's being produced by the one industry. In the second case, it doesn't hurt to have some other business in solving problems. So here's the point that goes to your question, I think. That is that we have to find ways to educate the public on this very powerful effect of nutrition. On that point, and I define nutrition as the biological expression of food. I don't mix it up with the word diet, food, and nutrition. They're not synonymous, really. I'd like to look at it from the nutritional perspective. Nutrition is not taught in medical schools. Not one medical school in the country. So doctors aren't trained in this area. In big research agencies, which funded most of my research, like NIH, for example, there is in the neighborhood of like 27 separate institutes, one for cancer, heart disease, and so forth and so on. There's not one for nutrition. So we're not focused on the research of nutrition. We're not training our doctors. And thirdly, the mechanism for doctors to be compensated, to reimburse for their services, from insurance companies or Medicare, whatever the case may be. It's not easy for them to actually collect reimbursement by giving nutritional advice. So we have a big political problem, I would argue. And so we have to address that question, really understand what's going on at that level. And I say that those agencies in the government that come out every year tend to, it's almost like the fallback position is to just push more of the same. Those are very political decisions run by departments that are political appointees, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of this and that, they're all political. And so it's really subject to the political will of the day, which tends to be, don't stir the pot too much. Let's keep on doing what we're doing. Try to do a little this, a little that, someplace. We need to have major overhaul. And the way we can get major overhaul, in my view, these kind of conferences, for one thing, I hope. The other is basically the government should be playing a little more active role in getting medical schools to offer nutrition in order for them to receive any funding that they may get from the federal sources. So that's one thing. And then just bring it to the attention of the public. We're not delivering this kind of information to the public for obvious reasons, because the corporate sector, two major segments of the corporate sector, are basically controlling the conversation and buying politicians, by the way.
Yeah. What advice do we get from disease groups, and what is a disease group?
Well, I'm not sure what exactly who would pose that question, but the disease group, I see it as degenerative diseases. I'll give some grouping I'm familiar with. Degenerative diseases are those kind that tend to occur with age. The higher and higher risk as we get older. Heart disease, various kinds of cardiovascular diseases, stroke and so forth. Cancers, diabetes, some autoimmune diseases as well, metabolic disorders. Those are the degenerative diseases. That's a group. A second group, we might say, are the infectious diseases, communicable diseases, usually diseases initiated by foreign organisms, pathogens, bacteria, now viruses. Now, I mean, we're becoming aware of viruses. We've had them all throughout our entire human history. But in any case, viruses, bacteria, some fungi, these little beasties that we're surrounded with. Those are the infectious, communicable diseases. We can transmit our disease to someone else. We can't transmit we can't transmit degenerative diseases to another group. We don't transmit heart disease. We don't transmit diabetes. Those are functions of what we do with ourselves. So there's a couple of groups. Communicable diseases initiated by pathogens, little microorganisms, if you will. On the one hand, degenerative disease is another one. And then there's others. There's neurological, behavioral issues too that don't quite fit that category, which have more to do with psychological, social. I mean, it's the whole gamut, I would suggest, of anything that tends to affect our behavior and what we think of ourselves and that kind of thing. Difficulties we may have mentally at times. That's kind of another category. That's my grouping. I don't know what it might mean for someone else.
What was learned from the nurses' health study, and please elaborate on its impact on fat?
Well, I've known that nurses' health study personally since its beginning. I've known the director. He's a fine fellow. He's done an enormous amount of work. They put out a ton of really good research, all on humans, by the way. That's really important to have that picture, image of what's really happening in the case of humans. So they've contributed a lot. They've really contributed a lot. There's not by any stretch of the imagination I wouldn't even want to question that. But unfortunately, that is just one facet of the information. Good and sufficient in many cases, maybe, but it's one perspective. The other perspective is sort of getting down into the nitty gritty of the chemistry and the biochemistry. How do diseases form? What can we learn from that? What can we learn from, basically the so-called mechanisms kind of thing? We call it biological plausibility. We live by a certain standard of, of criteria that's used to judge the quality of research in our Western world. They're referred to as sort of Bradford Hill's criteria, epidemiological studies primarily, but among those 9 criteria he has published, I think, in the first time in 1960 or so, maybe 64. When he published that, really outstanding scientist from the University of Oxford. But in any case, he had this list of things, and we've all kind of lived by that in the years since. One of those criteria, really critical one, he calls it biological plausibility. Okay, it's one thing to know how to do the research, which he speaks to. It's one thing to recognize the various kinds of research we get. We can see correlations. We can see here's present, now it's not here, cross-sectional, that kind of thing. We can talk about all those things, but at the end, and we can form opinions. Oh, it looks like A causes B, if you will. But at the end of the day, we ought to have some information to know if it really works that way under experimental conditions. That's what I call mechanisms or biological plausibility, as he says. It's actually learning how it works. And that was the end of the spectrum that I found myself in the early part of my career, because, as I said, I had this dilemma. What's true? Does animal protein cause cancer? That's kind of ridiculous. And the only way for me to really get at that, particularly given my bias at the time, my personal bias, the only way to really get at that is let's look at it to see how does it work inside of a cell, inside of a body. And I found a gold mine because there we learned a lot about these reactions and how they relate to each other. What are the factors on the outside that affect these reactions, which in turn translate into disease, if you will, or health. So the nurse cell study, come back to nurse cell study. They've created really a lot of recitable work. It's discussed about, it's presented, which is great, gives yourself a benchmark. Had some difficulties with some of the findings, but what the heck, that's what we do in science. I wasn't, in agreement as to some of the conclusions, but, early on, but I give them good marks.
What does the science show on the health impact from eating eggs or egg whites?
Well, eggs, it's a mixture of some fat, obviously, and protein, obviously, too. A few other things that are micronutrients as well. Eggs have been kind of excused, by some groups. They're okay. If you talk about plant versus animal-based foods, they happen to be animal-based foods, by the way, but they're not requiring the killing of animals. So they kind of get like milk and eggs. That's kind of the product of animals, and they kind of were set aside for their own sort of little grouping, if you will. But now to go back to the question, what about eggs? There are some studies showing that higher consumption of eggs is related to colon cancer. And, maybe a few other things. Again, a little bit reductionist kinds of studies, but nonetheless, been repeated a few times. Milk, we got a lot of evidence on milk now. That's not a good food. Even though I grew up milking cows, I mean, that was a personal journey for me to try to come to reconcile the information with my own personal background and my own eating habits. But in any case, milk and eggs, even though they're byproducts of animals, nonetheless, they're problematic because the nutritional characteristics of those foods are about the same as the nutritional characteristics of flesh. The worst part, the most difficult part of the story, I think, that we have to be concerned about is the fact that because the public wants so much dairy and they want so many eggs, we built factory farms, huge factory farms, millions of animals. And so under that circumstance, here we are, especially in the case of livestock, we're trying to create more and more livestock. They need more and more pasture. They need more and more land. That leads to some serious environmental problems. Not only the deforestation question that comes into play, but also these big farms, they lead to groundwater contamination. They lead to soil loss. They lead to climate change. That's the issue of the day, almost. We now know that farming, typical Western kinds of farming, livestock-based farming, is the key determinant of global warming. There's, that's it in a nutshell. If we were to really understand that question, then ask questions too. Why do we want to eat those foods? I mean, everybody can think, well, they taste good. I know my parents did, et cetera, et cetera. I know that very well. I was a farmer, essentially, and producing that stuff. That's the way I ate. That's what my parents did. So that's the way it is. But we have to come to terms with really asking ourselves really seriously: is eating animal food the right thing to do? I'm now at the point in my career, even though that's not where it started, I will defend the proposition that we should not eat those foods on the basis of all the science that underwrites the relationship to food. So, I don't know. I wandered in this question here, but you were asking about eggs and milk, and how does that relate to? If I hope I shed a little bit of light on that question.
Should we add fats to our diet from avocados and olives, raw seeds, raw nuts, hemp oil, flax oil, and even olive oil?
Well, the question infers, the way it was asked, the question infers, should we add fats from those substances to something, right? If that's the question, we should go easy on that, even though they may come from plants, because that extra added oil, first off, is addictive. The more we get, the more we want. And unfortunately, the kind of fat in plant foods, for example, tend to be more polyunsaturates. When they're great in the food, but when they're taken out and sort of used separately, they tend to be oxidizable, which in turn leads to the production of what we call oxygen-free radicals, which in turn is related to aging, heart disease, and so forth and so on. So I say eating those foods, avocados, nuts, coconut. Yeah, if we're eating it as whole food, we don't make a whole meal of that. That's crazy. We also can be addicted to that a bit because they're kind of high in fat, but they're good food. Those things are good food. So just like everything else, eat them, modestly. They have taste. If they can help us, get more into this arena of eating plant-based food, more power to them. I know there's some of my colleagues who want to say, no, none of that. I don't agree with that.
What's wrong with eating fish? A lot of people say it's healthy.
Yeah, that's right. Again, a lot of these things. Some years ago now, like 30, 40, 50 years ago or so, the early part of my career, there was some evidence that was arising at the time that fish contained a kind of fat, omega-3 fats, which are anti-inflammatory, for example, especially in certain kinds of fish, was a good thing. Omega-3 fats are good. They're anti-inflammatory. Their opposing number is that omega-6s, which are pro-inflammatory. So you got anti-inflammatory, pro-inflammatory. Fish had more of the anti-inflammatory. Looked like a good food. Just on that surface alone, you look at, that's not so bad. And there was some evidence from Eskimos in those days, early days. They were largely living on that kind of food and not supposedly suffering the consequences. That's was the early research that came out later. That wasn't quite true. They're also suffering some of the same kind of problems. But so, and meanwhile, too, the fish story, other than being a little bit fishy, I guess, in the beginning, the fish story took on a new dimension with all the environmental chemicals that we have, especially the aromatic hydrocarbons and halogenated chemicals that we were using. They get into the water and the fish kind of bioaccumulate that stuff in the fat because those are fat soluble stuff. And so some fish are a bit contaminated with some nasty stuff. And some have found, for example, that some of those chemicals, or 95% of the consumption of those nasty chemicals comes from fish. So that's a problem. Of course, the argument is made that, well, we can live with that, just don't eat those kind of fish. And there are some fish, they're better, and that sort of thing. First, that was one of the last foods I gave up. That and cheese, I guess. So the bottom line of fish is that there is some, let's say it this way. They're certainly not as difficult, not as bad as other kinds of animal foods. But they're not plant foods either. They don't have the antioxidants and dietary fiber and stuff that is so important for our health. They just don't have that. And there's lots of those kind of compounds. And so fish on balance, yes. I can understand a little bit now and again. But again, that raises another bigger question, much bigger question, and that's what do we do to our oceans? They're getting polluted. We're killing off the fish population. That's a really serious problem. I don't know how many people really know about that, but in our online course, we've got somebody real expert talking about some of that, and I wish, and the fish are kind of disappearing. The fish are kind of disappearing in many cases.
Why haven't you been able to convince the medical industry, universities, government, the USDA, medical journals, nutritionists, dietitians, doctors, media, and other sources of influence that a whole food plant-based diet should there be a foundation for what they recommend to the public?
It's a long haul. It's a long haul. The question is, why that difficulty? I might mention, for one, the film Plant Pure Nation. There was the Forks Over Knives. I was in that, as you know, and so we was telling our story, Dr. S and I in particular. But then the question rose, well, that question you just raised, why haven't we heard this before? That led to the Plant Pure Nation. My oldest son used the same producer, created the film, getting into the political kind of conundrum, that kind of question. And on that point, it really comes back to almost a political question, certainly a socioeconomic question without a doubt. But we have politicians that are elected according to what people want. That's pretty common sense stuff. But in any case, the politicians are going along with what people want. And so therefore, in the case of the dietary guidelines, they're not really coming out with the kind of, they don't have the structure to share this really good information because it's too much oriented to the animal industry. Politicians appoint, obviously, the Secretary of Agriculture, who is usually involved in a revolving door kind of situation with the ag industry. So it's really hard to stray from that model. First, it's what people want, they think they want. Secondly, it's the producers themselves who want to keep their business rolling. That's a tough thing to deal with. In the case of the pharmaceutical industry, health industry, we've come to rely, as we started in the beginning, rely on the use of drugs as a means of keeping us well, curing our illness. Yeah, sure, they do work. I mean, I'm not sure like anti-drug just at all. They can work, but to use them as the mainstay of health is nonsense. It's nonsense. But again, it's a huge industry. So to come along and say, hey, why don't we talk about food? Why don't we just let's sit down and talk about it. I can say to people, why don't you just try it? Stay on it for a little bit and see what you get. People tend not to want to do that. Too hard. All kinds of good and sufficient, I wouldn't say good, but certainly sufficient reasons. So I can understand that kind of behavioral pattern, but it's not to their best interest. And one more thing comment I might make on that point. As we switch from to a whole food plant-based diet, those who wish to try that, one of the things that people often discover is I can't quite handle it. They give up after a while. It's not for me. They go. If we wait these folks would wait for 2 or 3 months, just really stick with it. If they really want to do it, their taste preferences change. That's what happens. And so, I mean, I can speak from personal experience, and many of my friends and colleagues say the same thing. If you start eating this way, the first thing you know, believe it or not, as crazy as it sounds, we crave a salad. I mean, I would never have said that years ago, but you really get to the point where you're feeling good, things are working out pretty well. We had some illnesses, they kind of disappeared, and then it's kind of nice to feel good, and then recognize too that in order to get into this kind of eating, a little bit of patience, and just kind of keeping that. And there's other issues too there's sort of influencers, like for example, why do we kill all the animals we do? It's kind of an animal welfare issue. It's a pretty powerful argument, for a lot of folks, or environmental issues. So there's other externalities that surround us that really kind of fits into the same picture. Comes down, just let's eat the right food.
Why is it so hard to get medical schools to teach nutrition? And why don't they teach the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet? Is it because the evidence isn't strong enough?
Well, in my new book, The Future of Nutrition, it just came out, I try to deal with that question. And I deal with it from a historical perspective initially, but then talking about what I learned in the history, going back to the 1700s, by the way. What I learned, and this I did while I was spending a year at the University of Oxford with my colleagues there when we were working with China study. But in any case, I got into the history and found something that was really fascinating. Back in 1800s, late 1700s, into the 1800s, in the case of cancer, because that was more my specialty, if you will, I learned that there were two main theories of cancer formation and presumably cancer treatment. One said that cancer is a local disease. They just cut it out. You can imagine who thought that way. It was the surgeons. So they looked at cancer as a difficult but manageable disease. Just cut it out. That was called a local theory of disease. Okay. In contrast to that, there was another theory called the constitutional nature of disease. Constitutional nature. That phrase, constitutional nature, infers something about our whole body reacting in this way. Things working together, if you will. Well, it turned out that this really took hold firmly in the middle 1800s, and then carried on into the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s. At that time, the local theory of disease then was really pretty well established. That's what everybody locked into. It's, we could talk about something specific, maybe something definitive, something scientific. So radiation came into play. We could make narrow beams of radiation kill cancer cells. Chemotherapy came into play. We can devise drugs, to treat the cancer cells. So all of that was local, focused. I call it reductionism. One thing at a time. That makes money. That makes money because if you, in fact, in the evolution of intellectual property protection of business ventures, to get a patent, for example, you got to be able to describe it. If it's local theory and you're talking about a single chemical or single things like this, it's amenable to getting patents, trademarks, so copy, whatever the ideas. And so we focus on this one thing at a time. That then became the substance of almost of a nutrition way, because then nutrition, we're learning about food in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We got to a point where we could isolate certain nutrients became known as vitamins, each one supposedly dealing with one particular disease. That became the hallmark of nutrition. So nutrition became a science that was very reductionist, looking at one nutrient at a time. That's why we studied them. We put them in pills and we sold them that way. It's a $50 billion industry, essentially. We've always assumed that this is a way to get the benefits of food. Well, it turns out this doesn't work that way. I hate to say. The way nutrition, the way food works is not through individual nutrients, sort of doing their independent things. No, it's everything working together in this marvelous way. That brings me back to the constitutional of nature argument again, because now we see with this food and other things that go on around it, what's at the same time, we see that nutrition is a constitutional order of disease. That's what was discussed in 1800. That was dropped. That was essentially dropped because, for one thing, it didn't fit the economic model. But I would argue the constitutional nature of disease is what we can use as individuals. That's our game. As individuals, if we start recognizing that, we can then take care of a lot of our issues ourselves. We don't need to rely on getting sick and having somebody poke some chemicals into us to try to make us well. And that's nutrition. Nutrition is a holistic concept, everything working together. Eat the whole food. And in the process, by the way, I come down to two simple arguments. To keep it really simple, but acknowledge the complexity. I want to acknowledge the complexity. That's extremely important. But at the same time, I want to get the message simple. Two things. Eat whole food. Everything's, what I mean by that, what is not that you can chop it up, you can cook it, you can do this and that, but it's the idea of eating everything in that whole food more or less simultaneously, so that the body gets a chance to react to the total mix and work with it that way. Nature is amazing that way. So eat whole food. The second is make it plants. Make it plants. So we haven't talked about that here that much, but my real specialty in my career was really the question concerning protein. And I've come to learn that protein, there's animal protein, there's plant protein. Animal proteins, all different kinds, they tend to do the same thing. They increase blood cholesterol. They do a few other things, a bunch of different mechanisms. They cause cells to divide faster. They increase growth hormone. They do this, they do that. They restrict DNA repair. They restrict formation of more than modern day things, natural killer cells, which are part of the immune system. Animal protein does all that stuff. Plant proteins don't. Plant proteins got the antioxidants, vitamin E, vitamin C, a bunch of phytochemicals. They're and fibrous materials. That's all good stuff. And so, animal food, I don't see any. We do not need to get protein from animal food for starters. A lot of people think we do. No, we don't. We do not. We get plants got all the protein we need, and in fact, it's the right kind of protein. So I wish you get off that kick of assuming that, as I once did, that we need protein. Of course, we need protein. Protein is really important. It's a nutrient, but from animals, it makes no sense. Just make it. So two things: eat whole food. Number two, make it plants. And if people just did that, forget about all the other details. Not completely forget them, but pay less attention to the little detailed information that people tend to get. And just if they rely on just that, we could solve. My guess is easily 90% of our health problems. We can get the other 10% by doing some specialty things, maybe. But in any case, just eat the whole food. Can you imagine what would happen to the world in terms of healthcare costs? Wow. It would plummet. We're going to lose jobs in the process, but we have other things that we can do to help ourselves too. to create some new jobs for that purpose. So, you know, the idea to me is it reaches into the economics and into the political, the social, behavioral, ethical points of view, all servicing the same thing. Eat whole food, make sure they're plants. That's it. We can take some good things out of the plants, maybe like their so-called salt, sugar, and fat. They're all, you know, all interesting, good things. But you know those three things, be careful about adding them back. They're addictive, all three. You get some, the more you get, the more you want. And they do have some special properties that are not good if we overdo it. So, but, you know, I think in that way, for me, that enables me to say something pretty simple. You know, eat what greens you want, eat what grains you want. You know, there's a variety of tubers, there's a variety of legumes. Mix and match, there's infinite combinations, different ethnic cuisines too. We can still adopt the different ethnic cuisines because they just tend to distinguish themselves by their flavors, as we all know. So, you know, spices and herbs and flavors can kind of help us along in this journey. And we can maintain the different ethnic cuisines, and they have it.
Your research showed certain types of proteins increased cancer. Did it show sugar having any impact on increasing, feeding, or causing cancer?
Well, that's kind of an indirect question. It's an old story going back to the 1930s by Otto Warburg, a German scientist who got a couple of Nobel Prizes, by the way. It was a serious fellow. He was showing that, you know, cancer tends to grow in an anaerobic environment without the oxygen, but it still needs energy. It sure enough needs energy, right? Well, it draws on sugar. It draws on sugar to feed itself. So cancer is a kind of feeding itself in this oxygen-free environment, or relatively oxygen-free. You know, taking the sugar, and that sugar is metabolized in a way in which oxygen is not required. The first part of the metabolic cycle. So that stayed with us. That was a big deal, called the Warburg effect, and that kind of hung around. Cancer lives on sugar. You know, that took hold and became almost a popular concept. Sugar causes cancer. Sugar sustains cancer. Actually, when you look at it a little harder, obviously the story is much bigger than that. It's much bigger than that. But by the same token, I don't want to stray too far from that idea, because consuming refined sugar, sucrose, glucose, fructose, if you will, consuming refined sugar, that does lead to a metabolic disorder in a way that can kind of stimulate, possibly, disease formation, including cancers. Not so good, not so good. But I think the main emphasis for the sugar cancer hypothesis really had to do with Warburg studies back in the 1930s and into the 40s. Great biochemistry, very nice. But I remember seeing when I was first getting involved in research back in the late 50s, Warburg was just ending his stuff, and I remember his writing a rather impassioned letter to the editor of one of the journals, really complaining about that. Why don't they understand this? We've got, you know, the future is this and that. And I understand his enthusiasm for his research, but went a little bit too far.
One final question for you, and that is, why was it important for you to come speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Because, first off, the words and thinking about it. The truth about health. What a wonderful expression. The truth about health. Now we can all argue that we have our own truths. Now I'm going to argue there's something more fundamental than our own personal opinions about things. If we just look at the science, see how these work. And I'm talking about looking at observations, that are obtained objectively or not done transparently or displayed for the rest of the world to see, especially other professionals, get critique. So I'm talking about, some really good solid facts. That's really what informs. So when you say truth about health, I'm going to suggest, for me at least, that truth goes to really inquiring about what is the scientific fundamentals. And that's what served me. I obviously had to deal with a lot of issues that I was discovering, so to speak, that I didn't agree with. It ran against my culture, ran against my own life, and everything else. I had to deal with that. I had to deal with the pushback from my colleagues as well. So I really got to really respect the concept of science. So when you say truth about health, I just want to leave this for a final thought. Truth, let's get down and look at the verifiable, reliable facts, integrated as a whole. Integrated as a whole. So what I think your conference, if I may sort of get inside of the heads of you folks that put this together, the truth about health is lifestyle. So in other words, sort of, I think a good word. It's a total reformation in a sense of the way we tend to do things. And it is a lifestyle practice. It has to be a lifestyle practice. So congratulations on doing that.
Well, we thank you for that, and we thank you for joining us as you have a few times now, and so we really do appreciate that and all of your time. And with that, we'll let you get back to it.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Good to see you again. Thank you so much.
Good.
Take care. Bye-bye.